Meeting of the Judiciary House Judiciary Committee, and we really don't have a specific agenda today. We were to have a new member, I thought, to introduce, but I haven't seen his arrival yet, so we'll hold that up. Hopefully he'll arrive shortly. Going through, looking around for our various staff people. We all know the charming Jill Travis, who is our Legislative Council representative. Glad to have you always with us, and she does a great job keeping us in line with what the best wording of law should be. Jordan Reed is the counsel to the committee and works very closely with us in various bills, so he'll be the new Susie Womack. Not prettier, but new. Who else we have here? Introduce our Seth and Liz. I've got your. These are two, one Georgia State Law School and Georgia Tech, which we are still allow her to come sit with us, be with us. And who else? Do we have anybody else here today? No, I don't think so. All right. We have this as an opening meeting. We also have invited Georgia Appleseed, who's here representing Georgia Appleseed. And we're going to have a presentation. Jordan, if you will help distribute this materials, please. They do a great job for the children of our state, and they've asked to make a presentation to us today. So if you would like to come up, and you're going to be by yourself?
Yes, sir.
All right. We will give you the opportunity to have a seat, and if you will, speak in the mic, introduce yourself and who you represent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Rob Rhodes. I'm the Director of Projects with the Georgia Appleseed Center for Law and Justice, and I'm here with our Executive Director, Sharon Hill, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. And also thanks for the service of the Chair and of the members of this committee and your counterparts over in the Senate for your work in furtherance of the Governor's commitment to major reform of our adult criminal and juvenile justice system. Remarkable improvements have been made and more are to come, I know. A key foundation necessary for the effective administration of our criminal justice system is an environment of high mutual trust and respect among our law enforcement agencies and individual law enforcement personnel and the communities and the individual citizens of those communities that they serve. This environment, of course, has been challenged recently by the high-profile events involving use of force around the country and around Georgia, resulting in death or severe bodily harm to members of the community. Like many of you, or certainly all of you, following the events in Ferguson in the summer of 2014 and the subsequent events, Georgia Appleseed began to think about what we could do to be helpful, to add value to the process. And so in the spring of 2015, we began a process of fostering crucial conversations around the state about law enforcement and community relations. As most of you know, Georgia Appleseed is a nonprofit, nonpartisan law center. Our goal is to increase justice throughout Georgia through law or policy reform. And we do what we do. We're a very small organization. You see, 50% of or 40% of our full-time staff here today by leveraging the volunteer services of lawyers from around the state of Georgia and other professionals in support of our work. We say that we investigate, then we disseminate, and then we advocate. And very much we start off any engagement that we have with an intent to be fact-based, objective in our analysis. And in particular, in connection with this matter, we were driven by two equal commitments. One was our awareness and our respect for the difficult, important, and oftentimes dangerous job that law enforcement personnel do for and provide to our society. And secondly, an abiding belief that all citizens of this state are entitled to the protections guaranteed to them by the federal and state constitutions. And so with those operating principles, we began a process of investigation. We took a look at some of the work that was being done around the country to assess critical issues related to this important topic. And we identified a number of potential areas for asking crucial questions and engaging in crucial conversations. They fell into two basic buckets. One bucket was what sorts of law or policy changes might be appropriate to improve community police relationships in a way that we would reduce the likelihood that we would have these critical use of force incidents in the future. And the second bucket was what sort of law and policy reforms might be helpful in assuring that if we have such critical incidents in the future, that the post-incident investigation and charging decisions are both fair and perceived to be fair by the community. So we identified those issues and we engaged our volunteer lawyers from around the community led by our pro bono lead partner, the firm of Nelson Mullins, in extensive legal research on these issues. In addition, as we always do, we thought it was extremely important to engage stakeholders from around the state. So we began that process as well. We reached out to over 500 individuals from across Georgia, from a broad spectrum of interests, to include law enforcement from a police standpoint as well as prosecuting attorneys. We reached out to the faith community. We reached out to the business community. We reached out to the nonprofit community, virtually any segment of our communities from around Georgia. And we did this in a broad geographic scope. We ultimately engaged in the interviews with 140 stakeholders from around the state of Georgia, from South Georgia to the North Georgia mountains and from the coast to the river. We did this by training 180 volunteer lawyers and legal assistants and other people from law firms around the state, primarily here in Atlanta, to do these interviews. We developed questionnaires focusing on these critical issues. We had the questionnaires reviewed by a contractor to the CDC who does their work to make sure that we were not asking the questions in any sort of biased way. And these folks spread out across the state and had 2-hour interviews. These were not short telephonic interviews. They were mostly in-person, very intense interviews. And all this information was collected and compiled. The results of our legal research and the results of our stakeholder interviews were compiled and put into a report which is titled Seeking the Beloved Community, Fostering Crucial Conversations About Race, Law Enforcement, and the Law, which was issued last week. And on last Thursday, we presented in detail to a symposium sponsored by the Atlanta Bar Association on this issue. A summary of our findings and recommendation is included in your materials. Given the limited time I have here today, and I'm happy to talk to any member of the committee at greater length about this at any time, and of course to respond to questions, I will just note that many of our recommendations require a more detailed analysis and more detailed conversations than could occur during this session, and we recognize that. We are planning on holding community meetings around the metro Atlanta area and throughout Georgia to present these recommendations and to get further input from citizens from all perspectives to perhaps modify or augment our recommendations as we move forward and develop a plan, if appropriate, to come back to you for suggested legislative action in the 2017 session. However, I want to speak today on a limited number of areas where we think there's at least some possibility that we might have consensus on legislative action that could occur even in this expected to be sort of truncated session in 2016. And let me talk to you about two basic areas. One is training, police officer training. We believe that there is consensus among all the folks that we talk to, virtually all the folks that we talk to, including representatives from the law enforcement community, that it is time to take a careful look at the minimum training curriculum required for our law enforcement officers in Georgia. We believe that that view is shared by the leadership of the Police Officers Standards and Training Council, and we're happy to see in the budget that Governor Deal included some funds to support the hiring of a curriculum specialist. We're suggesting that that language be developed that would establish some guidelines for posts to use, and making sure that when they review this curriculum, they do so with an eye toward assuring that Georgia's police officers receive the highest quality of training, world-class training that reflects modern policing best practices. We also think that some sort of reasonable time frame for this analysis should be put in place. Finally, we recognize that to the extent that the recommendations are to enhance or to increase the training, we'll have to come to grips with the costs of that. The cost of police training, for the most part, especially for sheriffs and municipalities, are borne by those local governments, and we understand there will be costs about those they need to pay. But we think at least the start should be looked at. How do we need to augment it? What would be required? And then how do we pay for it, including potentially use of funds that are already available that are being allocated for other purposes at this time. We also suggest that the legislation call for the establishment of a multidisciplinary advisory committee. We believe this would add to community buy-in and acceptance of the revisions and any changes. This is based upon the effort, some of you may be familiar with CIT, or Crisis Intervention Training, which many of our police officers implement now, a very well-regarded training program, 40-hour training program that helps officers learn how to deal and respond to people who are presenting with mental health or other issues. In the course of developing that curriculum, a National Crisis Intervention Training Advisory Council was established and was very helpful, and we think a similar organization would be helpful in this process as well. The second area where we think there might be potential for near-term action in this session relates to data. As we said earlier, we're a very data-driven organization. You all and the Criminal Justice Reform Council emphasized in many respects the importance of data as you assess the need for change in our criminal justice system, and the need for data to measure the effects of any changes that we have made, to include the emphasis on, for example, community-based alternatives for our juvenile offenders to keep them out of residential detention centers. So data for almost any organization is important, both from a standpoint of internal management and in particular for public organizations, for transparency and public accountability. Our research found that there is simply no, while Georgia law requires, and in Georgia through the GBI does a good job of collecting arrest-related data and reporting it through the Georgia Criminal Information Center managed by the GBI. Arrests are not the only circumstances in which community members are engaged with law enforcement officials. It's particularly noteworthy to note that there is no current requirement in Georgia law that use of force incidents resulting in death or bodily harm to a citizen are centrally reported and made available to the public. We think that's a significant missing link, and we would urge immediate legislation that would require the reporting of such incidents, the collection by some central agency, be it GBI or another organization, and the regular reporting of those data so that the public will be aware of it. This should not be a particularly resource-intensive effort. The information, we believe, are readily available within the various departments, and happily there are not that many of these incidents. So we believe at a minimum that type of data reporting should be required. We also believe that it would be important for law enforcement agencies to report on the demographic makeup of their departments. While it is absolutely clear, every expert that's written on this subject has said that there's no guarantee that a diverse law enforcement agency will result in avoidance of these incidents. There is concern that to the extent that the police department does not look like its community, that's at least a red flag and potentially raising problems of trust and community relationships. So our recommendation is simply that these data, which are readily available, be published annually by the police departments. Data are just data. They're just numbers. They may result in people asking questions, but that's a healthy process. The final recommendation that we have here is a little bit more broad, but we understand, we believe that police agencies around the state are collecting a lot of data, but that data is not collected on a consistent basis. It's not collected and reported centrally. We don't know what the answer is. We believe that there are additional data that will help, that the police department should collect, that will help drive their operations and understanding of the operations, and that would help the community understand better the level and extent of community engagement with the police department. Right now, for the most part, we're limited to anecdotal information, which is troubling. We suggest that some entity, in our report, we suggested the Criminal Justice Reform Council, but subsequently we've talked with the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, and they may be a better option, but that some agency simply be charged with asking the question, what data with regard to police community encounters are being collected, what data needs to be collected, how do we fill those gaps, what would be the costs, both in terms of monetary costs and operational costs to fill those gaps, and then how do we pay for it. We don't know the answer to the question, but we think it's a critical question that needs to be asked so that we can all operate on a common set of facts as we assess the situation. So those are the areas where we think there's a potential for activity in this session. We stand ready to work with each of you and with all stakeholders. We've reached out in the recent past and talked with a number of stakeholders, and we will continue to do that. But we appreciate the opportunity to present on this. We think it's a critical issue facing our country and our state, and we're happy to collaborate and be a partner with you and with other stakeholders as we search for solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. I think you may have some questions from members on the committee. I have a couple of comments I'd like to make initially, and that is the speaking about data as far as employment numbers. Is that required currently by federal law as to breaking down of the ethnicity of your employees, even the police departments?
I don't know whether or not that is required. I do know that we've made a pretty extensive effort to try to find publicly available information in Georgia about those data and couldn't find them
at a central location,
or even if you went to the police department website, there was no report on that issue. We think we know the data are there, and it would be a fairly simple matter to report.
Okay. I noticed the recent announcement by GBI that they will be the ones who are the investigating agency now of any shootings by police officers, which I think is a major improvement, because it does now take it beyond just the local department as a source of getting a proper investigation, independent investigation, I should say. Is that something you think answers the concern you raised about that point?
We include in our recommendation that the legislature mandate that these incidents of concern, use of force resulting in death or bodily harm, be investigated by an independent police agency. As a practical matter, that's what's happening now. And as announced yesterday, the Atlanta Police Department has undertaken to request GBI to do that, and we know that the governor's budget includes a substantial amount of money to add 20 or so new officers given that extensive caseload. I've talked with Director Keenan, and I know he's expressed some concerns for various reasons about there being a mandate for that, and we would be happy to talk with him and others further on that issue. It's always that question, if you're doing it anyway, what's the problem with having it mandated? On the other hand, if you're doing it anyway, why do you need a mandate? And we think there's room for further discussion and to try to resolve any concerns that the GBI may have with that.
Thank you. And lastly, the training issue, which I think is vital, and having standard procedures. I know that we have two organizations. One is called CALEA, which is a national certification program, and I'm hearing a lot of questions by police departments and sheriff's officers that they don't really prefer using CALEA because they frankly don't do as thorough a job as they used to, maybe. Cost is pretty expensive for it, but we're having set up in the state a standardized certification program within Georgia. And I want to say personally that I hope that we can pass a resolution that will encourage all local police departments and sheriff's departments to go through a certification program, because that is where you see that there has been appropriate standards adopted by the department and the personnel are trained and properly prepared to perform their duties. So what's your comments on that?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our report discusses that issue. And I think the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police has done an excellent job in establishing a state-level certification process, which is now voluntary. About 120 police departments around the state have undertaken that certification process. That's a relatively small percentage of all of the departments, but still it's a positive step. The CALEA program, I think 30 to 35 or so state departments have done that. In addition to the concerns that you raised, which I'm not aware of, it's a cost, in many cases, a cost issue. It's very expensive to go through the CALEA process. So as a practical matter, only the major urban police departments, for the most part, engage in that process. So we understand. Again, we appreciate Chief Rotondo's working with us on that. I know he has some concerns about making it mandatory, which we would be certainly wanting to engage and talk with him some more. The other issue, which is we also think important, is to have the standard operating procedures that do exist to be transparently available easily to the public,
Sure.
which is not the case now.
All right. Ms. Oliver, she's left. Who? Judge, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, have you gone with this initiative to the Public Safety Committee here in the House or Judiciary Non-Civil?
We've not to the Public Safety Committee. We've met with Chairman Golick, and because we're aware of his interest in the issue, in particular with regard to the participatory rights that law officers have in grand jury proceedings. So we have met with Chairman Golick, and we look forward to continuing to work with him.
Well, I guess I certainly with Judiciary, but it would have just appeared to me that a lot of this has to do certainly with either criminal law or criminal procedure, and that you might want to start your initiative and with those committees and work through. That was just
That's a good point, because and I appreciate that, and we'll certainly engage them, because one of the critical issues that we raised in our report, which clearly cannot be addressed in this session, is some troubling language in the statutory provisions relating to authorization of the use of force. And again, I won't go into detail here, but if you have an opportunity to look at the report and look at the language, what our statutes say, they seem to authorize use of lethal force in circumstances which are beyond what most police departments truly authorize in their operating procedures.
Anything further, Judge?
No.
Mr. Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Rhodes, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, sir.
Mr. Rhodes, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming today. I appreciate you telling us about this. How long has the Georgia Appleseed been around?
10 years.
10 years. Okay.
Yes.
You based here in Atlanta?
We have we're Georgia Appleseed. We have an office in Columbus and Atlanta, and we're aggressively trying to establish offices in Macon, Albany, and Savannah.
Yeah, are there similar? Is this a national organization, or is this just a Georgia?
Georgia
organization?
Appleseed is an outgrowth of a network. Many years ago, some folks from Harvard Law School decided they wanted to endow a new type of legal services organization. So they began the process, and they created the Appleseed Network, which spawned centers around the state. So there are Appleseed centers in multiple states. They're in New York and Alabama and South Carolina, all over the country. We're independent. We're independently funded. We work on projects sometimes together and share ideas. But the point is that there's a lot of good work being done by the Atlanta Legal Aid Society and Georgia Legal Services Program representing poor people individually. But we're an organization that tries to take a look at broader policy issues that impact disadvantaged folks in a way, and then try to see whether there are law policy changes that could improve that. And we've done a lot of work as part of the Just Joe Coalition in the juvenile justice arena as well.
You mentioned you were independently funded.
That's correct.
How are you funded?
The bulk of our funding happily comes from contributions from the major law firms around the state of Georgia who work with us. We have a strong board represented by most of the law firms that you might recognize here in Georgia. We have a significant amount of foundation funding. We're pleased that the Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta provided some funds to us for this particular project.
I see. Do you make the funding sources public?
Yeah.
Okay. The chairman mentioned something that you brought up about isn't the racial makeups of departments public knowledge already anyway, and it.
Well, if it is, we weren't able to
That's
access it readily. I mean, we know intuitively that
Right.
APS is a highly diverse system, and we know that to be true for Savannah and other places. But
Atlanta Police,
yeah,
APS.
APD. I'm sorry,
APD.
Atlanta Police
Okay.
Department.
Yeah. What is Atlanta's racial makeup? Of
I don't
their
know.
police
I
force?
mean, we tried to find out. We didn't ask them specifically. We just think that the information should be easily available to the public.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Appreciate you coming.
I'd urge you to try an open records request.
Hmm.
I think you can find it that way.
Well, that's true, but that's viewed sometimes as being a little bit overly aggressive. So we wanted to see if it was available another way.
Representing a city, we get hit with 10 or 15 a day, it seems like. So
I understand.
they're pretty well,
Well,
expected.
I just to respond to Representative Fleming a little bit more. I think we pride ourselves on what I call collaborative advocacy.
Yeah.
We don't rule it out, but we've never engaged in litigation to solve a problem because we think it's a pretty blunt tool. So we think you get more working with folks than you do with hitting them over the head.
Well, thank you for coming today, Mr. Rose. We appreciate your taking the time and your report and comments. So
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman
Great
and members of the committee.
Do we have a new member, I believe. We're glad you joined us today, sir. Huh? That's all right. Hit your button. We got a little button on each one of these mics, and I can tell. Why don't you, first of all, as you come in midterm, which is you're the only one, I believe, as a new person on the committee, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and how you are now serving as an attorney.
Yes, Taylor Bennett, represent District 80, which is Brookhaven, Chamblee, Sandy Springs, Dunwoody, Atlanta, DeKalb, Fulton counties. We got elected in August, but happy to be here. Again, I apologize for being a few minutes late. I practice law on the outside of being a legislator. Plaintiff's employment work is typically kind of law I practice, so I'm excited to work on the committee.
And your schooling?
Oh, this is probably get me in trouble.
Tell it all, brother. Tell it all.
I did undergrad at Georgia Tech. I know I got a fellow Tech guy here, but undergrad at Georgia Tech.
We'll separate y'all too.
Yeah. Did my law school at John Marshall right here in Midtown. So.
All right. Well, we're pleased to have you working with us, Mr. Bennett, and I hope you enjoy your time on the committee.
Thank you.
We still have tradition of all new members singing fight songs.
Anything further come before the committee today? If not, we will stand adjourned. Thank you.